The Archaeology of Death and Memory with Professor Howard Williams. It's Archaeodeath.
Archaeodeathlings, welcome again to an exciting Archaeodeath interview with another special guest. And this time we're going across the Atlantic to talk to Joe. Joe, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Yes, my name is Joseph McGill, the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. Hello, listeners.
It's wonderful to have you here, sir. And, we've been I've been doing about 9,500 of these little interviews over the last 5, 6 years. Talk to archaeologists, historians, heritage professionals, different aspects of our relationship of to death and memory, distant past, recent study, recent history, but it's the material that fascinates me of how people connect to place and stuff. And this project, knowing you through TikTok and learning about what you're doing, really captures my sort of sense of how that sort of local history but with global stories really is the way that we can tell people about the past. And your project, so would you mind starting off by giving us a little introduction to yourself and how your project started off?
Yes, I am the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. Slave Dwelling Project is a very simple concept. I find slave dwellings wherever they are in the United States, and I spend nights in them. Now, how did I get there? Well, luckily for me, I spent time in the U.S. military. 2 of those years spent in England. But I also, when I was stationed in Germany, had the opportunity to go to Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, I went into the space where Anne Frank was living in her her solitude or her hiding from the Germans. And in being in that space, it kind of opened my eyes. It kind of gave me an epiphany. It kind of planted a seed that would lie dormant for a while. And that dormancy would come to life through my employment with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Um, Being employed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, I learned that there was a desire to save old buildings. Um, and in saving these old buildings, I had to take that idea and apply it to this project. Now, the project, Slave Dwelling Project, when I was growing up, when I was being educated in the state of South Carolina, I was taught that education that was given to me left me in a place that made me think that my enslaved ancestors were happy to be enslaved and the enslavers were benevolent people. That's the education we all got if we were in the public schools. And uh, that education was influenced by what the United Daughters of the Confederacy made it. Because after the Civil War, after the South had lost the war to the North, the North won the battle, the war, but the South won the narrative
Yeah.
because the United Daughters of the Confederacy out of Tennessee took it upon themselves to make it a noble cause. The Moonlight and Magnolia, that influenced the education so much that it made me think those things I thought when I graduated. Plus, Hollywood did not do much better for the young minds because rarely did I see any positive images of me
Yeah.
on the big screen, on the TV, or in movies. So they were reinforcing what the educational system has had imposed on our young minds, and it certainly did that to me. Now, luckily for me, after I got out of the military, I went to South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, South Carolina, to studying for my English degree, which I did obtain. But during my between my sophomore and my junior year, I had the opportunity to be employed by the National Park Service, and I got to work as a park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument, where the Civil War started. So, to be that park ranger, I had to do the research necessary to be that park ranger because I knew I was going to be challenged, and rightfully so. I should have been. And in this research I was doing, I came across the evidence, the proof, the receipts that what I was taught were lies, that were lies and half truths. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I learned that I come from a proud past of of uh, of Africans who were able to manage all that they did and survive the Middle Passage and that era in our history that produced the African Americans, and most of the African Americans in the United States today. So I that was good, a good thing, uncovering all that. But I also learned that all the people who were being praised, the Confederates, the generals, the people of that era, aren't as saintly as I was taught they were. These folks were vicious barbarians in some cases, um, immoral, and learning that element of history, helped bring me to the place to make the decision to start the slave dwelling project. But even before that,
Yeah.
as a park ranger, I would encounter Civil War reenactors. But these Civil
Ah,
War reenactors that I would encounter were Confederates who were actually portraying Confederates. And they wanted me to join their outfit, which I did not do because, as I stated to them, I'm not joining your organization that's glorifying a period that enslaved my ancestors.
no.
I refuse to go there with them.
Mm.
But also, right around that time, the movie Glory, Denzel Washington, Matthew Broderick, Morgan Freeman came out. The black soldiers. It highlighted the fact that 200,000 African Americans served for the Union during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And that's the reenactor I wanted to be. And that's the group that I started in Charleston, South Carolina. And then starting this group, we would go to historic sites, places where battles had happened, and we would reenact those battles. And there would be an audience there to take in all that we were doing. But then the audiences would go away, but we would still have intimacy with the space, the historic space where we were. Sometimes plantations or some place where a battle took place. So that gave us access to those places with the people not there, with the audiences not there. And in doing this, it gave us an opportunity to have campfire conversations. And in these campfire conversations, these various groups of Civil War reenactors have their campfires. I would go from campfire to campfire and getting into the heads of these Civil War reenactors. And what I learned is that a lot of reenactors, they were not as educated um, as I I was. Certainly not as educated as I was, but some wanted a different outcome. Some would prefer that it would have been a different outcome, and they still had the opportunity to enslave people. So I learned from going from campfire to campfire an element of what I now implement in the slave dwelling project. Because the slave dwelling project was me simply telling friends of mine of this crazy idea in my head to go and sleep in slave cabins, just as I was sleeping at these historic sites doing these battle reenactments. Um, and they kind of stood by and waited and uh, thought that the thought in my head would go away, but it didn't. Once I put the idea out there and I got this list from the State Historic Preservation Office that they supplied for me of the places that I needed to consult to go to because they knew State Historic Preservation Office in South Carolina, and they bought it because it was about preservation, like-mindedness. And because it was about preservation, I got the list that they provided and started making phone calls, making my odd requests. Now, luckily for me, I got enough yeses that's after that awkward pause after I asked him the question of me coming in to sleep in your slave dwelling. Um, I got those yeses, enough yeses, before I got that first note. And because it came in that order, you know, I had to go for it. I had to go with it because I had these places scheduled. And my very first sleepover was at a place called Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. And the TV crew showed up, um, and
Oh,
other members of the staff there showed up. They did their thing, they did their publicity, and they all left and left me there to carry out what I said that I was going to do, and that was to sleep in slave dwellings. And of course, my intent, as I was explaining my intent at that time, was to bring attention to these dwellings.
yeah,
Because if we say the dwellings, then we could then talk about the people or interpret the people who built them, who lived there, who made everything else that people pay to come see possible.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I went through. I finally I finally got to sleep after all kinds of thoughts going through my head about escape and mothers giving births to babies and not having ownership of those children and um, bloodhounds and stolen labor. All those thoughts going through my head, and the fact that on this particular plantation, they had a wedding earlier that day. Yes, weddings on plantation is a thing um, in these parts, kind of like getting married at a concentration camp, but that's how I feel about it. Um, so that was going on, and the residuals of that was still going on, and I had to contemplate all that as I heard the loud music and the people reveling off in the distance from having that wedding. But the next day, which was Mother's Day of 2010, I woke up and not being familiar with the project, sorry, not being familiar with the property, I
Yeah.
took a walk. And I took a walk to a place, and I ended up in a place you would love. It was the cemetery where the enslaved people are buried. Now,
Oh,
enslaved
wow.
people, I found out because, it was an active cemetery up until maybe 1999, the year 2000, because
Oh, right.
the headstones revealed all that. But the headstones also reveal that some of those people were born enslaved and died free. And where those headstones ended and where the tree line started in that grassy area were these indentions in the earth. These indentions in the earth was evidence of those enslaved people lucky enough to have been buried in a box. That box would eventually give, and the earth above it would conform. So I had that revelation then that it was for those people that I was about to embark on this journey from that point. So now, 16 years later, 26 states later, and the District of Columbia, I've stayed at about 150 sites, but maybe about 250 sleepovers because some of these sites I stayed in consecutively. They
Oh,
would just
right.
keep inviting me back year after year after year, and I could only count them one time for the portfolio. So that's kind of the long way of how I got here. So I'll pause right here.
No, no, that's wonderful. I mean, there's so many thoughts going through my head, but I mean, at one look, that it's chilling to think about these things, which I know independently, but hearing it as part of your experience of going to the first one, and there was a wedding going on, and of course, I've heard about this. I see we've had that talk with that, not ghastly Nottoway plantation site where they've never engaged with the heritage, and many others that. But yet, in many ways, that's quite eerily accurate to the experience of enslaved people in the era before emancipation, when they would have been, their suffering is in literal auditory interaction with the pleasure and the opulence and the grand house and all that. And yeah. So that was my first reflection. That's not really a question, but I just had to sort of say that. And the other point is that this is something I do with my own kids going around UK. great houses that are now in the ownership of the National Trust or English Heritage or Cadw, the Welsh. These are beautiful places. They're serene gardens, but I'm a terrible. I'd ruin every trip they do. Think of all the labour that would have taken to build that. Think of where they got the money that then they reinvested in the local quarries from Jamaica, from their sugar plantations, to then build the local quarry that made the money that allowed them to do this. And I'm a bit of a killjoy, but this is the point. It's not comfortable. It's our past is global, and it echoes every corner of our world, and the British landscape is populated this way, not with enslaved people directly, but with the knock-on effects of empire and colonies and so on. So, but yeah, they were just sorry. They're just thoughts. I wanted to ask just quickly about this conversation around the campfire, because for me, when you're dealing with social media, it's a lot of posturing and projecting online. When I do my lectures, even workshops and seminars with students, you rarely get to hear what they think. They're constantly dancing around, what does the professor want us to say, what is the reading about. But when you're on a campfire, you finally get to hear what people actually think, and often it's quite chilling what people really believe. And so it was that long-term conversations. You revealed some of these reenactors were actually in it because they were ignorant, or they generally wanted a different history. And that is scary. I just want to just clarify that. They basically, it just trickles out in conversation that, yeah, it wouldn't have been great if they're sitting there talking to you. So
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So that's why, when January 6th happened and
Yeah.
I saw images, I was looking very closely to see if I recognized any of those guys,
Yeah.
because, those kinds of thoughts were being revealed to me around these campfires, which would not have surprised me had I seen an image of, one of those guys, which I didn't. I'm glad I did not. But those thoughts are certainly still, still among us. That's why we're dealing, right now with, we were in a place where we were going in the direction of taking down those, the icons that
Statues and stuff.
that were memorable for you to remember the Confederacy. We were going in the direction of removing those.
Yeah.
But now that has switched. It's going back, to the place where we've got to see these images in public again, and that's not a good place to be. So yeah, but as far as the presently, we talk about things. We talk about things that people don't usually talk about amongst people who don't look and think like them. We talk about white privilege, white supremacy, historical trauma, and historical trauma is that's a very wide subject, because it answers the questions of why you don't see a lot of Black folks going to plantations. That's not on our short list of places to visit, because I talked about weddings on plantations and things of this nature. And a lot of these plantations, when they first came online, they certainly weren't doing some of the things that those plantations that are now doing the right thing. They certainly didn't start out that way. They were portraying what they learned. And what they learned was that bad place that I was left in 1979 when I graduated from high school, happy slaves um, and benevolent slave owners. So we talk about those things. We talk about, of course, now the most recent elephant in the room is, critical race theory. That an element of law that people don't understand, but they legislate it anyway, because it's a term that they could kind of trigger that can trigger people.
It's an acronym. People hate acronyms. They go CRT, DEI. If it's got three, it's got to be bad.
That's right. And you're right. That elephant in the room, DEI. So that's what we talk about around these campfires now. In fact, I promote the campfire now more than I promote the sleepovers. But if indeed there's an entity out there that want me to come and hang out with them, If indeed they insist on doing the sleepovers, I still do that. But I know that I have more behind me than I have ahead of me. Um, and there's more substance in these campfire conversations. As you alluded to, you're eye to eye with people. And these sites tend to disarm people, as in, they let the guards down and they're willing to say more and talk more and say some of those things they don't usually say again amongst people who don't look and think like them. So it's being quite quite useful in this slave dwelling project and how it has evolved.
Do you feel that people, when you're going there alone and you're doing your sleeping project, which then promotes and attracts further activities and events and group, do you feel it reaches people who not normally be interested in history, or is it people who are more already history enthusiasts but they don't know about this kind of history?
Well, my my audience is quite diverse. If you look at the institution as it existed, as it started back in 2010 up until 2016, that's 16 years. There came a point in the in its evolution very early on where I had to make a decision when people finally started wanting to spend time in this space with me. um, Initially there were only black folks. Then I went to
Mm.
Texas and I got the question from a white gentleman who wanted to spend the night in the space with everyone else. And I paused. I gave it some thought, but I'm glad I said yes, because otherwise I'd just be preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
So now when I go to these places, I offer people the opportunity to come and spend the night in the space. I say, come one, come all. No, up until the time COVID started, people were kind of standing in line, waiting their turn to, have that opportunity to come and sleep in these historic spaces. No, the only ones I shooed away were the ghost hunters,
I
because,
was going to ask about that. Right. Okay. Go on. Go on. Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
there are always those, and I had to, make it clear in 2010, because in that period, during that time, those ghost hunting outfits were quite popular, TV shows and you
Oh,
know
yeah.
all kinds of stuff. So I had to shoo them away quite quickly to let them know that this was not about that. It was about bringing attention to these spaces, singing the praises to those who still allow these places to exist. Because them allowing the spaces to exist taught me something as a preservationist. As a preservationist and hanging around with preservationists, I learned some things about ourselves. We're kind of uppity folks, uppity in the sense that we think that this preservation should be done our way. It should be pristine.
Yeah.
It should be as close to the way it was when it was first built. Up until this period. Well, see, what we want to disregard is adaptive reuse. We want to disregard that some of these places are private properties, and these people can do with these properties what they wish. And I learned that the hard way. I went to a place in Missouri, and a, 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 a lady had just acquired property with a nice, beautiful big house in the slave dwelling right in back. And the preservationist, we got in her ear saying, we got to do it like this. You can't do this. You can't do that. And she got so frustrated with us that under the cover of darkness, she tore it down. So so I had to back off and
Real. Yeah.
let these folks do with these property as they wish. All I can ask is that they interpret them, properly. So there's been all kinds of extremes for me as far as the type of buildings I've slept in, the ownership of these buildings and what people use these buildings for. I've slept in offices, she sheds, man caves, dirt floors, museum ready, ready for prime time, bed and breakfast. I've slept in them all.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And I hadn't fully appreciated that. I'd assumed different levels of neglect, but I must admit I hadn't fully appreciated just the diversity of function. And yeah, I mean, if I'm immediately imagining, because I feel I'm a bit schizoid in this regard. I go from it's all right, it'll break, everything will break down, and then I go, no, you mustn't do. I feel the two sides of myself pulling in these directions, and the rage I would feel just sort of encountering sort of, shall we say, some profoundly disrespectful or inappropriate uses, but you can't. It's their space. You can't. It's how do you pitch that to someone? You can't really. As I understand, you've got to sort of tread carefully around people's egos and sensitivities. But so is there anything you didn't expect to come across that you particularly found? Oh, sorry, did you want to answer the question?
Yeah, let me complicate it even more.
Yeah.
So Nottoway Plantation, I think I heard you may have alluded to it. So Nottoway Plantation burns to the ground. Now, Nottoway Plantation was notorious because if they got to the story about the enslaved, you had to probe, you had to ask, it's like pulling teeth to get that information out of them. The information they gave you would, one like me would just be pissed. One like me would them rather not say anything at all than to hear what they tell you. So weddings is what they're known for. So that place burned to the ground. So of course, my DNA and the people similar to me were reveling. The ancestors had spoken. They had the last word. Blah blah blah. So again, folks with my DNA. Now I have to put on my preservation hat and says, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm a preservationist," and embodied in that building was the work of our enslaved ancestors. They weren't the architects, but they were the physical builders of that building. So their work is going up in flames. So we have to find that medium. We have to find that middle space. If these places out there, coming in to this weren't doing the right thing, then let's help them do the right thing. Tell them to do their research a little differently. Those letters that they use to talk about whoever the white folks were staying in that space. Look at that letter again, because in that letter they may reference an enslaved person, beating them, selling them having a kid, their property. They are going to be treated like that in these letters, in these ledgers, in these wills. So look at those as opportunity to, prove their existence. If you peel back the layers of this building, of this structure that people pay to come see, look at those marks in those trees, in those beams that used to be trees. Who put those marks there? Enslaved people. Look at the bricks. Look for fingerprints in those bricks. Whose fingerprints are those? Interpret that as such, and then you can go deeper from there. If you just want to keep it to the physical space and interpreting that, and the fact that, and if you're inside the house, if you're in the nice beautiful kitchen, where people they like to take folks into the kitchen, see the nice place setting, talk about how the food got to that place. Talk about the fact that there's probably somebody in the backyard or in that back kitchen cooking that food, or that animal that's on that plate was probably butchered that morning or that day before by enslaved people. Talk about that when you interpret your story. If you want to incorporate these stories and the lives and the agency of the enslaved people who were there.
And that's one of the things I don't know about Nottoway particularly, but generally is that whatever happens in the main house, the beautiful, pristine, is kind of, could be argued in some instances, at least, to be far less relevant to the surviving humble outbuildings and the slave quarters, which would have been ignored anyway. So whatever goes up in flames, there's still a story there in the landscape, in the ditches, in the fields, as well as the dwellings. They're the fields that are the inheritance. They're not exactly as they were, but they're the spaces. And this is something I can connect to teaching my students about, the British landscape too, is that, there's the great houses, there's the castles, there's the abbeys, but there's also just the hedgerows, the fields, the trackways. And we can't go back in time and access the names of everyone that walked those fields, walked those trackways, but that is the very fabric of the landscape, that enslaved people encountered. Or so I think, yeah, it's about trying to get people away from that sort of chocolate box image and that sort of magnolia. It sounds lovely, magnolia plantation. It sounds wonderful, until you learn stories of people that worked there. And it was not a static story, was it? I mean, it was. We're talking about many centuries, as well as the immediate. People think of the immediate pre-Civil War as but also it went afterwards, of course, because it's not as if people just suddenly went around, oh, we're free and we've got all this money, and the landscapes persisted, the work persisted, didn't it? So there's it's a disturbing story.
Yeah, we gotta define the word chattel. Chattel. I think if people understand that word, they can understand slavery better in these United States, because I'm often reminded, people telling me, well, there were Africans selling Africans. Yeah, true. That was the case. But that slavery in Africa was different than here. In those cases, it wasn't chattel. Those Africans, were spoils of war, and they had a chance to, be free. Any child born to an enslaved woman in Africa was not born, free. I'm sorry, not enslaved. That
Exactly.
child was born free. It was different here. We're talking. Um, not only are you enslaved, but your children and your children's children would be enslaved. So, I have to. I find myself explaining that a lot here in the U.S.
And the scale, the brutality, the perpetuity of slavery is something that people are finding any excuse to try and distract from. But I suppose when you're in the dwelling spaces, getting back to the spaces, it's surely that tangible presence is a kind of material witness. It challenges people who would be deniers, or try to it confronts people, doesn't it? It makes it almost impossible to wiggle out of that. I don't know, maybe people still able to do it. Cognitive dissonance is a big thing, but I'm just hoping that it's a way, by being there and having conversations, is very different from a textbook or a video on YouTube or something like that. I'd be hopeful to think that it may be, but it still feel you still feel it's difficult to get these ideas across.
Well, it difficult, yes, but not impossible.
Yeah.
We have the ability through technology to bring our story to a public more readily, and that's a good thing. You know, that's a beautiful thing. Now, this can also be a bad thing, because there are folks occupying spaces out there that and they're using it for evil, and and not and not good. But I counter when I talk to people about AI, especially people, the historians who are so much against it. Um, I have to kind of, I guess, walk the fence. I guess this AI thing is going to happen with or without us. And I want to be there as much as the next guy, influencing people are having the few viewers that I have. They know that I'm pretty consistent. That's why I get a lot of strikes on TikTok, and a lot of community guideline violations.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
because I'm pretty consistent. I'm going to put the message out there that I put out there, that uncomfortable message. Um, and we have to we have to do our part to and I say it like this. People have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because if if we think that you know being comfortable is the proper way of life, then we'll never overcome what's being done right now, with these attempts to quash the history or rewrite the history, or silence, put a warning label on the Smithsonian. What kind of craziness is that? They want us to unlearn what we've learned. And I think that's going to be a challenge, because there are just too many smart people around to want to regress and go back into a place of ignorance.
History should always be uncomfortable and challenging, but people don't want history who don't want that. They just want a benign little fun story to tick a box and say oh look, I learned a bit of. Did you know in the like fun fact, in the 1920s, yeah, da da da. And that's good. I love that type of history. That's fine. I'm not people who create that kind of content online and do that's great. It has its place. It grabs people's interest, but it can't always be just at that immediate return. That has to be just one way of doing it. And we had to have those uncomfortable discussions. And I mean, your project has been a successful, long running. You're now doing conferences. You're now. Do you feel? Is it in existential crisis from these second time around Trump nonsense, or do you think this is a shenanigans that will rapidly be overcome? How do you feel about where you stand with your project, in given the fact you're named in documents, you're infamous according to the White House, and
Yeah,
as an example of I don't know what you're called. What you called woke, or what was the latest derogatory? Are you woke? Oh, yeah. Well done, well done.
yeah.
But it, but that's good. But my point is, do you feel this is, a crisis point, or do you feel the storm will be weathered, the struggle will go on? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's kind of like being on a banned book list, being named in
Yeah,
that attack on the Smithsonian. But I I came to this realization 16 years ago. I think people are just getting caught up, to what I've known for 16 years. And anybody who has followed the slave dwelling project, I think those people are well informed, well aware of what's going on. Now what did these people do? Um, November November 5th of 2024. Um, you know, were they the ones that took us back to our factory mode? Because we're kind of in that factory mode now
yeah,
uh, of of colonization and of how we were colonized, and
yep,
in the purging of natives and the enslaving of Africans, and the fact that we are coming up on a time where the numbers show that maybe around 2042-ish, whites aren't going to be the majority anymore here in the United States.
yeah,
And and I think this is kind of that last gasp to hold on to that authority and the privileges that all that whiteness brings. Um, but this is, I think that the numbers also will show that this nation is getting browner. And because it's getting browner, we're getting closer to what the forefathers at least said. I can't I can't say what the forefathers did because 25 signers of the Declaration of Independence enslaved people, 41 signers of the wait a minute. Let me get it right. 41 signers of the Declaration of Independence enslaved people, 25 signers of the Constitution enslaved people, 30 Supreme Court justices enslaved people. So, those were people who are considered, founding fathers of this nation. Um, and now what they put down on paper, I think we have gotten close to those places. Um, a lot of times. And I think we certainly are closer to it now because of the demographic shift that's coming about in this nation. But, in this demographic shift that's coming about in this nation is going to be a majority of minorities, a conglomeration of minority groups who are the majority. But the important part of that is that the white won't be the majority anymore. And I think that's the biggest fear. And
right.
that's a lot of the pushback that we're getting right now.
So they've got their own crisis that they're trying of because the far right are always the Musks. They're obsessed with demographics and population numbers and breeding, and they're and it's very 19th century. It's eugenicist. But so yeah, I think you're right that this is a moment, and it's unclear. The future is always unclear, but this is a moment where they're looking to history to try and both return to and to create a new kind of order, an old order, and it's about prevailing through that. But I mean, that's why projects like yours that would otherwise be seen as, to use a Douglas Adams term, mostly harmless. Oh, that's nice. He's going to talk, chilling out at some slave dwellings. That's not going to harm anyone. That's black history. That doesn't need to concern us. They're directly the administration's threatened. They see this as a oh my God, this is the roots of things that will supplant us, which is very weak and fragile, isn't it, in many ways? But equally, it shows the power of history as well, doesn't it? The positive power of these stories.
Yeah, and I tell folks like myself, um, and we use our power for good and not evil. Um, we got to make sure that we are the keepers of those receipts. We got to get behind the Smithsonian Museum and those other museums, those other places that were doing the right things, those plantations that were engaging with the descendant communities. I think that any plantation that exists well within a safe radius, very close radius of where they are Black family members who are descendants of those who were enslaved at that plantation. Well, how engaged are you with those descendants? And I think, if they can answer those questions and check themselves that way, and if they aren't involved, I think they should be involved with those, with those people. I know there are some out there who are afraid of things. They're afraid of that R word, reparations. But reparations is not always money. Reparations is sometimes doing what the National Baseball League did. Once upon a time there was a Negro League, there was the National Baseball League. Well, now those records are merged. That's reparations. So now these guys, those the Negro leagues are now higher up in those records than some of the white guys of that period. They're still there. Their names are still there. It's just that it's revealing everybody who was who was a part of that. Their place is still around, like Brooks Brothers. Brooks Brothers used to sell clothing to enslavers. Sometimes a nice tidy stuff for the coachmen and the stewards and people of this nature. But they also sold a more inferior cloth for the field hands. Yes, right. Brook Brothers. So maybe it's not paying something direct. Maybe it's peeling off a fraction of every sale and putting it into a reparation fund of sort. A reparation fund that might pay for a higher level of education for anyone who wants to take advantage of that. So yes. So you say that word reparation, people go to their corners and start yelling at each other. But I think if you kind of sell it in the manner that I just said, it might be more palatable.
Well, there's also more creative, and it allows people to think about everyone can benefit from a better education, but also everyone can benefit from a better understanding of the historic landscape. You may one may have struggles about feeling culpability or guilt, but that is for white people to start to begin the journey on. That's not a problem for, so for me, it's really interesting that, being taken to upsetting and uncomfortable spaces and challenge, they're only uncomfortable until you come to some kind of resolution about them, and that is an educational journey. And if we can have more engagement with these spaces for everyone, then it surely it can be challenging. I was taught by a Jamaican history teacher at school, and one of the first things she went into was not the transatlantic slave trade. She brought that up as background. She went into the Maroons and talked about free slave communities in South America and the Caribbean, and talked about those. And and you could see a lot of, there was a mainly white group of 12-year-olds, but many of us were just going, what's this got to do with our history? And then, oh, but these are your colonies. And it was like, and you could see people who perhaps hadn't read enough already, it started to drop in, and they started to realize. And I think that many people just don't get that engagement. So I think that it's only positive if we keep moving with these initiatives.
Yes, yeah, definitely keep going in that direction. And if we need to push back against those who push back against that kind of history, that type of history. Um, you know, banning books, um,
Hmm.
and things of this nature. And I got to saying, I often say it starts with banning books,
Yes. Yeah.
because if you could control the minds of people, then if they could ban the books, then they could put warning signs on the Smithsonian um, Museum. That's another element of controlling the
Yeah.
narrative. When you control what people learn, you could leave them in that place where I was in 1979 when I graduated, and that's not a good place to be.
I do want to ask you, and I meant to ask you earlier, but it's come in the wrong order. But this is always the way with my interviews. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned the ghost hunters and that more sort of celebrity, sensationalized, sort of paranormal stuff. But there are surely a spectrum of ways in which people do feel a spiritual connection through the plantations, the slave dwellings. A very traumatic one, of course, but they feel a connection to people that were there before. And I don't want to necessarily pry about your personal feelings, but do you feel that is part of the mix of how people who involved in your project interact with the space, or is it? Are you very clear that you want it not to be about any spiritual connection? You want it to be very much about the history and the lives lived. I'm
Okay.
just fascinated. Yeah.
Well, I like the way you asked the question because you're separating ghosts and then you're putting spirits in another
Yes.
category.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for that.
That's what I wasn't. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think I already talked about the ghost hunters. I shooed them
Yeah.
away quickly.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Now, those are the ones who are more spiritual about it. Most of the time, black folks.
Yes.
The ones who are more spiritual about what they want to experience there. Um, Come on. Initially when I started, it would go so far as people would want to come and they want to do the libations and pour the in honor a liquid to the ancestors, and everybody in the audience didn't understand that, and I had to explain it. And before I said, we're going to be doing libations, and I would explain it the best way that I could. And if anybody should object, now's your time to object, because if anybody objected, we won't do it.
Okay.
But never did we not have to do it.
Right.
Never did we have to say no. Never did I have to say no, that you can't do that. So if people want to get connected that way, I'm okay with that. Do I try to do that? No, I don't. And because that's usually my number one question. And when I tell them my answer, they get a little standoffish, and I have to explain to them that I don't mind you coming in for that reason, trying to commune with the ancestors. You may have that power, and if you do, then you do your thing. But that's not me. That's not why I'm here. If that is possible, that could be burdensome. Although I know their intent towards me would be positive, my intent for them would be positive because I show it in my actions. Um, but that's a lot. That's some heavy stuff. I
Yes.
I gotta deal with what I gotta deal with, because if if I should talk to the wrong ancestor and they're pissed, they're gonna express that to me. Now, I gotta talk to these homeowners, these property owners, and that could come out. It won't be my intent for it to come out, but if it's in there, it certainly can be detected. And
Yes.
I said I want to deal with the physical things I know that I can control. It's all about preservation. I want to praise you for being the steward of this space and letting me come in and do what I do, so that we can share with the public that this place exists. So that's my answer.
That's a really interesting, because I must admit I cope with studying even the distant past, dealing with burials. Have to be very dispassionate. I have to be very, but some things get to me in an unpredictable way, and I think we're all like that because we're all human. Whether it's a spiritual connection or an emotional connection, and when I'm doing lectures or on field trips, and I just turn around and go, oh, we've been talking about this, and oh, and here's a grave of okay, and sometimes it hits me even when I'm performing as an educator, and I think it's important we have barriers, not in a for our own self, to make sure that we can persist in this journey without it becoming too much in whatever particular way, but we're giving space for others to have their own way of interacting. But I think that's one of the things that in many ways I'm guessing you haven't said, but I'd like to ask next is you're not taking people to cemeteries, which are so profoundly emotive. Whether the spaces still have visible memorials, they're still in use, or you're the dwellings that allow people presumably can explore that if they want to. But you're focusing on the living space. Is that an active decision or just a casual as
Yeah,
it's happened?
yeah. The dwellings are always the star,
Yeah.
when they're there, but they're not always there. But see that's when I had to get creative because when I first started, um, when I would go to these places, the first place my host wanted to show me was a big house, and initially I said no, I wouldn't go in.
Yeah.
And but then I learned I was making a mistake because within the big house is a lot of opportunities to do some interpretation, spatial interpretation, Spatial, because in this space, you can go through the front door and see the nice, beautiful staircase gives you access to the upper level. Well, now I've put people on notice that always ask where that second set of stairs is. Because
Yes.
that second set of stairs is where I'm interested in. That's where the slave dwelling project enters this space. So we interpret that.
Yes,
So
of course.
sometimes we sleep in the big house. I've slept in many big houses. I've slept in places where slave cabins used to be. We'll pitch a tent in that space where slave cabins once were. And see, that has enabled us to stay relevant and talk about more. Now, as far as cemeteries are concerned, sometimes we are in these spaces by default because, those enslaved people were buried somewhere. And a lot of times, a lot of these spaces that I go to, uh, these graveyards have been encroached upon.
Oh yeah.
In fact, when I'm through with this, I'm going into the city of Charleston to deal with the situation. The College of Charleston is building a whole new dormitory over mass graves. Um, I'm also going to the International African American Museum, where when people were shipped uh, uh, into this nation to be enslaved, a lot of them, 40% were shipped through Charleston. And the International Museum is built over a warehouse. Um, they elevated it, but the bottom space is where that one of these warehouses was, where enslaved people were stored until they were sold. And during our conference that's coming up here in October, we're going to be spending a night in that space. So when the graveyards are there, we do visit those graveyards when we can, and we
Yes.
interact with those spaces when we can.
Thank you. Wow, this has been such a pleasure and a privilege, but also a profound opportunity for hopefully new audiences to hear about your ongoing project. And you mentioned your conference, which we have to plug, and we'll put in the description a link to that and to your project more generally. I just wanted to sort of close with any final reflections you have for us in terms of the importance of history of dwelling places. Anything else you think we've missed out that you think audiences should know about?
Yeah, I think that I think that everybody should be interested in history, but I think it's very important now to be interested in global history and what's
Yes.
going on globally, because there's a lot going on globally. Lucky for me, I spent some time in the military. I got to travel to England, stationed in Germany. I think those were the most learning that it taught me more than my college degree. Put into this cranium of mine. Um, I get along best with people who are well traveled. People who not to discount people who were
No.
born in one place and died in the same place. A lot of those people are well traveled. And I get along better with those because they have more open minds. So I think we should encourage that as much as possible. Doing what you're doing what I do through social media is only one element of that.
Yes.
But I think we all need to physically go to those places, physically go to those Anne Frank places so that you yourself can have that epiphany, so that you yourself can learn the importance of preserving places, spaces. Now, those spaces may not tell the positive, comfortable parts of history, but they're parts of history nonetheless that need to be to need to be remembered, and um, uh, and it can help us get along better globally.
Follow Archeo Death on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.